So we're continuing this march in talking about image. What does it mean to be an image? So it says God created man and woman in his image. And then in 128, here's what he says. Here's sort of the call to those images. And he blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Okay, same thing he said to the animals. But here's the difference. To humanity, he says, subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And so the difference between us and animals is that we're called to subdue and to exercise dominion. So we as images of God have some sort of power and some sort of influence, and that's really consistent with ancient Near East ideas of what an image of a king is meant to do. So kings, as I mentioned, would place their statues in the city, and that meant that wherever that statue is, the king's rule, the king's power, the king's influence also extends to that territory. So in a sense, what God is doing is he's placing little images, us, to represent him, but also to exercise some kind of power and some kind of authority over his creation. Now, whatever that may look like, we'll unpack that a little bit, but whatever that exercise of that power and authority, dominion and subduing looks like, last week we made sure that it was very clear that we do it in relationship with God. That the way we exercise dominion, the way we exercise power given from God is in relationship with God. That our wisdom in how we decide how to exercise that comes from walking with him, comes from understanding his heart, that we know this is how my God would exercise his dominion in this situation, and this is how I'm going to exercise my dominion in this situation. But to understand what the scope of that dominion is, the scope of what it means to subdue, we actually have to look back and see what God was up to before he created humans in Genesis 1. And this is a little bit of review from when we first started this series in January. So here's what God was doing. In verse 1 of Genesis 1, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. So the key is actually verse 2. The earth was without form and void. So what did God do? How did God exercise his power and dominion in Genesis 1? So what he did is he took something that was formless, something that was chaotic, something that was void is not empty. It just means it's lacking order, right? So he took something that was chaotic and formless and disordered, incapable of producing and sustaining life, and he spoke order and purpose into it. So that creation's no longer just this chaotic mess, but now it has the potential to produce and to sustain life. And this is very common in ancient Near East creation stories, where their God would wrestle with chaos and overcome chaos, and out of chaos bring land and earth, or like land and sea, and out of that now the earth could produce. That's very common. The difference is, in those stories, their God had to fight a war. Our God just spoke, and everything came into being. Our God just told chaos to calm down, and everything came into being. So that's what God's dominion look like. So what does our dominion look like as representatives, as images? It's actually the same. So what is God calling us to do as little images? He is calling us to take the potential that he infused into creation. He's taking us to take the order that he infused into creation and help it to thrive. So God is handing over the creation project to us little images in partnership with him. There's all sorts of confusion. If I asked a lot of people, what does it mean to be the image of God? There'd be a lot of different opinions. Is it a quality we have? Right? Is it our conscience? Is it our consciousness, our self-awareness? Is it our creativity? What is it about us that makes us the image of God? Well, Genesis 1 talks about us being images of God, not as a quality we possess, actually, but it's actually in a job we share with God. Whereas God took chaos, brought order, and helped it to thrive, in our sense, what an image does is the same thing. It takes chaos and order. God has given it potential, and we're meant to cultivate it so that it thrives. That's why if you look at the same thing in Genesis chapter 2, when God puts Adam in the garden, he says in 2:15, the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. So what's he saying? Humanity, take this garden, which has potential, and tame it. And bring order to it. Help it to thrive. Help it to bring life. Will a garden produce life without a gardener? Yes. If I gave you a garden and you didn't touch it, it's going to produce life. But it's not going to produce life and thrive in a way that it could if a gardener tames and subdues it. Without the influence of a gardener, yeah, there'll be life, but not the kind of life that helps it to grow and thrive. So here's how I'm going to define, in this context, what it means to be an image. So as images of God, we are representatives of God who have meaningful influence, meaning power and dominion, over how this creation project goes. That's a pretty bold statement, that humanity, God has given humanity meaningful influence over how his creation project goes. Okay, but here's the thing. You and I, as far as I know, do not spend most of our day gardening. Okay? Back then, in a very agricultural culture, maybe, they would understand that this has a lot to do with the land and with nature and whatnot. But what does it mean for us, who are not gardeners, to help creation thrive and to carry the creation project forward? Well, I'm going to sort of hone in on one aspect of what this might mean. I want to just remind us that if we're called to help creation find true life, I want to remind us that creation also involves humanity. So one way we could interpret our call as images is that we are not just to help nature and animals and birds and fish to thrive, but one way we could understand it is we are called to help humanity be fruitful, help humanity thrive, right? And that's the call we see all throughout the Bible, is God tells his people, take this little expression of Eden and plant it here so that my kingdom spreads throughout the world. That's what images do. Images bring the rule of the king to wherever they are. So God is telling us, take my kingdom, take this expression of Eden, take this hope, take this life, and plant it there and let it grow wherever I planted you, all around, right? And so we're called to bring God's kingdom to humanity. So let's hone in on this a little bit more. What I'm going to do to frame this talk is I'm going to frame this talk in the context of, is the church called to influence and transform the culture around it? Okay, so let me say that again. Is the church, you and I being part of that church, in fact called to engage with culture so that we influence and transform the worldly culture into a more God-centered culture? And if you understand what it means to take the creation project forward and that the creation project involves humanity, I will say that we as individuals and as a church are called to use our influence and our power, not just to transform nature, but actually to transform humanity and culture, to bring life into humanity and culture, to bring life into our homes, to bring life into our families, to bring life into our workplaces so that it lives in a God-centered way of thriving. But here's the question: how do we do that? How do we practically exercise the dominion, the power, and the influence that God gives us in our day-to-day lives to bring about a God-centered transformation in creation? Because the Bible is very clear that we need to be careful how we exercise our dominion and influence. Let me look at Genesis chapter 47. This is the story of Joseph. It says in 47, "Now there was no food in the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought money into Pharaoh's house. When we read the story of Joseph, here's what I first thought it was about. God wanted to save his people from famine. So what did he do? He placed a follower of God, Joseph, in a position of authority so that he could use Joseph in a position of authority with wisdom to save his people. Isn't that sort of how it's given to us? Like, God happened to, God used this horrible thing that happened to Joseph. He put him in a position of authority, and Joseph grew in power. But fortunately, Joseph knew that famine was coming, and God used Joseph to save his people using Joseph's influence, power, and authority. In a sense, yes. But there is a part I actually didn't read. Didn't read carefully and think about. Because in verse 20 through 21, here's what it says. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. Look at verse 21. As for the people, he made servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other. What did Joseph inadvertently or purposely introduce into his sphere of humanity? Or maybe not introduce, but amplify. Slavery. Think about that, right? Here Joseph, using his power, it seems like for good, saving God's people, but in the middle of that, how he influenced his dominion is he made people servants to Pharaoh. What did that end up doing in the end? Now God's people eventually, through what Joseph brought into Egypt, became slaves and servants to Pharaoh. So here's all I want to caution us with. And I use this as a cautionary tale because I don't know, I've been guilty of this. I think there's a believer in power. They're going to change everything so that it's God-centered. Whether that's government, whether that's my boss, whatever. There's someone in a position of power dominion who is a believer. They're going to change it for the good. Joseph certainly seems like that. But planted in his exercise of power was the seeds that actually ended up enslaving God's people. Does that sort of decision take creation into thriving? It does not. It is not fulfilling the calling as an image. So what I want to do today is dig a little bit in how to exercise the influence and the power and dominion God gives us, because it actually is not about having influence and power. It's how we exercise it that becomes important. Or I'll say it this way. It's not a question of whether or not we have power and influence. We do. Some of us don't feel like that, but I guarantee every single one of us is an image of God. God has given you some sphere of power and influence, whether that's in your home or your friend group or what. There's some power and influence you have that helps guide the creation project. But it's a matter of how we exercise the power and influence. Doesn't matter if we have it. Doesn't matter if you're a boss. It doesn't matter if you're a supervisor. It doesn't matter if you're Insta-famous, right? That's not it. It's actually how we exercise it. So I'm going to do this in a very negative way. I'm going to tell us how not to exercise it, and then I'm going to let us wrestle with how to exercise it, okay? Because the Bible, if anything, asks us to meditate on it, not giving us answers all the time, okay? So here we go. The first thing I would say, don't make creation serve us. Don't make creation serve us. During the Enlightenment, there came this thought in humanity that nature was an object to be conquered by man. And so people use that as a justification for us being able to do anything we want with nature, with creation. And a lot of people started getting that mixed up with Genesis 1. Look, Genesis 1, Christians and humanity are supposed to have dominion. And so we have a right to do whatever we want with the earth. And the church started believing that, and society started believing that. But that is not the picture that Genesis 1 and 2 paint. That is straight up from the Enlightenment. If you look at Genesis chapter 2, here's what it actually says. What did God say for man to do? Work it and keep it. In other words, your job is not to exploit creation, but to be a steward of it. Take care of it. Serve it. That's why if you look at biblical laws, there's laws about how to farm. So we're not abusing the farmland, but we're letting it lie fallow, and there's all these laws about that, right? So our job as having dominion and power is not to force nature to serve us. John Walton said it best. He said, even though God has provided for us, it's not about us. The cosmos is not ours to do as we please, but God's place in which we serve as his co-regents. Our subduing and ruling are carried out in full recognition that we are caretakers. Okay? Whatever humanity does, it should be directed towards bringing order out of non-order. That is how we exercise dominion. Anyone know who George Whitefield is? George Whitefield in the 1700s was an American preacher who, through his preaching and ministry, brought about a huge revival movement in America, and also was one of the first ones to start what we would now identify as the Methodist movement. And he was very against slavery at the time. He would really go against people who had slaves. And through his ministry, he felt compelled to build orphanages. Really good, right? People need orphanages for the poor. But his orphanages started struggling financially. And so what George Whitefield did is he partnered with some really wealthy people in South Carolina, and they decided to buy land and create a plantation. South Carolina was free state, okay? So they decided to buy land and build a plantation and use the plantation's profits to fund the orphanage. But the plantation was not profitable unless it introduced, anyone know? Slaves. And so what ended up happening is George Whitefield started to petition the state to allow slavery. How can that happen? Right? So someone in a position where God is using them powerfully takes such a wrong turn. And you know why it happened is because he partnered with people who were using their influence and their dominion to force the land to produce for their needs of profits. They wanted profit. That makes sense as a business person, right? And so instead of understanding that we're not to exploit nature, they were going to wring every amount of profit out of that land, even if it required using slaves. And so let me put it this way. Don't make creation serve us, but serve and steward creation. It's not about using our power so that it serves us, but that we actually serve and steward nature and humanity. Right? I mean, my job as a teacher is exactly like this. I have power over the kids, right? Sort of. Or they think I do. They're convinced I do, so they go along with it. But those kids are not there to serve me, right? What am I there? I'm there to serve them so they reach the potential God infused in them to be images, right? To do hopefully great things. Some of those kids I don't want in any position of power, but that's okay, right? And so don't make creation serve us, but serve creation. Second thing, don't use force, right? Don't exercise influence through force or coercion. This is really obvious, so I'll go through this quickly. Today is Palm Sunday. What happened on Palm Sunday? Jesus walked into Jerusalem and they laid palms at his feet. What did that represent? That represented, here is the victorious king coming to enter Jerusalem. What did they think he was going to do? Go to war with the Roman Empire so they could be free. In other words, here comes our Savior. He's going to use force to exert influence and power and free us from the oppression that we're feeling. That's what they were expecting. Use force to exercise dominion and power. And then he goes and dies on a cross. I'm just going to leave that right there. They were all expecting Jesus to start a war and use his power with a display of force, and then he goes and dies on a cross. If that isn't the most opposite way of exercising dominion from using force that I've ever heard, I don't know what is. Sometimes I watch kids interact. I watch my kids interact a lot because they're stuck together, right? And here's what I came to notice. When kids feel frustrated that they are unable to exercise dominion and influence over each other, they don't know what to do. They don't know how to negotiate with each other. They always use physical force or some sort of force, right? So if you can't get your friend to come with you and you feel frustrated at your lack of dominion over them, you grab them and you bring them with you. Adults, we use the loudness of our voice or our emotion. And we sometimes feel, when we feel helpless over a situation, we feel if we get louder and angrier, that will accomplish the life change that we want to see in the situation. That will bring cultural change if we're just loud enough and angry enough, because people will see, wow, they're really angry. That's why we have the term Karens, right? They're really angry. I must obey them. That's not what Jesus did. Jesus did not get louder. He did not get angrier. He did not use force. He laid his life down on a cross, right? We can get angry, and I've talked about this, and that'll bring compliance, but it will not bring redemptive transformation. People will obey. I use the stop sign analogy. If you're in the middle of nowhere and there's a stop sign, that stop sign, through force and threats of legal action, will make you comply, but it will not change your heart to agree that I should stop here. So not through force or coercion. Lastly, do not exercise influence through status or titles. That is not the kind of dominion God uses to change the world. Matthew chapter 4, verses 5 through 7. This is the temptation of Jesus, and he goes out to the wilderness. And he overcomes, right? Here's what it says in verse 5. Then the devil took him to the holy city and set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone." Jesus said to him, again, it is written, you shall not put the Lord God to your test. What is the devil saying? Exercise power through your status and title as Son of God. Use your title, use your position to exercise dominion over this situation. But Jesus consistently fights against using status as a means of exerting power. We've looked at this verse in Mark before, but remember the disciples were all like, I want to be next to you, I want to be second in command. And here's what Jesus says in Mark chapter 10, verse 41. When the 10 heard it, so the other disciples heard it, they began to be indignant with James and John. Verse 42, Jesus called to them and said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. Verse 43, but it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. See, I don't know. Sometimes I think if I can just get to this position, if I can just have this title, this job description, then I can influence change. But Jesus is saying it's not about the status, because think about this. It was actually when Jesus gave up the privilege of his status that he ended up changing the world. It wasn't when Jesus took up his status. It was when he gave up the privilege of his status as God that he actually changed the world. So exercising godly dominion, being able to influence culture around us and things around us, has very little to do with your status or your resources. It doesn't matter if you're rich. It doesn't matter if you have all these resources to pull from. That will not create the change. That will not take Creation Project in the right direction in a lasting, redemptive way. Anyone know Charles Finney? Charles Finney, also a famous American revivalist. But the problem and the main critique with Charles Finney is because he pastored a lot of very influential people and a lot of wealthy people, he too supported slavery. Or more specifically, didn't speak out against slavery. right? Because he was surrounded by people who used their influence and their status as a way to move the world. But his son, Charles Finney's son, was sent to the indigenous American tribes to learn their language, working with the poor, right? To learn their language so he could preach to them, working with the lowly. And he supported the abolitionist movement. You see the danger of status, the danger of using that to change the world. So it's really important, and we'll explore this in a few weeks when we talk about how we rule each other. It's really important to understand that how godly power is really exercised. Because if you look at how Jesus changed the world, what did Jesus change? How did he didn't influence the kings, and then the kings made some decree that changed culture. Jesus worked with the powerless, and he didn't put them in positions of power. He actually put them in positions of dependence on him. Jesus worked with the powerless, and working with the powerless who were desperate for him, they changed the world. Had nothing to do with status, had nothing to do with position, influence, force, nothing to do with that. I think the clearest picture of this actually happened a couple of weeks ago. So I'm going to show a video in a moment, but if you were here for the Green Arc people who came and shared their testimony, what caught my ear was this testimony about this boss. So he was a boss of a company, right? So he has status, he has position, he has leverage over his employees, and God changed his life, which actually changed the behavior of the company around him. But I want us to see how he did it. So if we could play that.
And at this conference, this husband was able to turn his life around.
戒烟戒酒
He quit smoking, quit alcohol.
戒槟榔
He quit the betel nut.
然后他带他的那个 team 呢去山上工作的时候呢，他的 team 看到他，这个老板你怎么变了？你怎么不一样了？你怎么不再嚼槟榔？你怎么不再喝酒了？你怎么奇怪也不说脏话了？怪怪的。
When we went back to the mountains, where his people at his company would say, "Oh, what's going on with you? You're no longer eating betel nut. You're no longer smoking. You're no longer drinking alcohol. You're no longer."
他跟他的团队挑战说：“你们现在看我哈不喝酒不抽烟。如果我要拿烟来抽，你要把我的手打掉，阻止我一下。”
And he would challenge his team. He would tell his team that, if you see me smoking, if you see me drinking,
所以呢，我就带他去便利商店买了很多口香糖来替代。
So I would take him to the convenience store and buy some bubble gum for him.
我要说的是，我们每一个人虽然信耶稣，不是每个人都是完美的，我们都有问题，我们都需要挑战。
Everyone who believes in Jesus, we all have our own problems.
所以他有一天他在工作的时候，突然发现奇怪，我买的口香糖为什么不见了？甚至怎么少掉了？怎么会这样呢？
And he would say, sometimes he's going to work and he would say that, what's going on? Why is my bubble gum disappearing?
他发现他的工人拿去吃了。
He found that his team would take it and
他发现他的工人也戒掉烟了。
And he found that his team members would also quit smoking.
不到2个月。
Not within 2 months.
然后呢，吃完了便当也把它叠好、洗好，然后做好分类。哇，这是不可能发生的。
And then the bin down that they would have, they would clean it, they would put it away, and they would neatly organize it.
Did this person, in some tiny way, influence culture and the humanity around him so they could really thrive? I say yeah. I mean, we're much better off not smoking and chewing betel nut. But did he do it through status, even though he could have? No. It was something else. What was that something else? I'm not going to answer that because I don't quite know, but I'll leave you to wrestle with it in a moment. So in conclusion, here's all I want to say, right? Are the ways we talked about exercising authority and power and dominion necessary at times? Oh, yeah. God uses force to prevent much worse things from happening at times. And I think we sometimes are called to use force. Are we called to use our status and influence to maybe make certain things happen. Oh yeah, it happened. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, and I'm not saying it has no place. But I'm just saying that that is not the way Jesus exercised power and dominion and influence, and that's not the way we exercise power and dominion and influence so that we bring redemptive transformation to the world around us. Right? The way the world exercises power is through titles, through show of emotions, through status, through whatever, right? But the way that God, I'll just say this again, the way God exercises dominion, the way God changed the world was through the cross. That's crazy. So there are two thoughts I left unfinished. So can we put up that slide? Right? He said, don't exercise influence through force or coercion. I never told us how to do it instead. And don't exercise influence through status or titles. So I'm going to leave that to you. So just as a way to sort of process in your groups of, I always say 3 or 4, but it ends up there's like a group of 7 here. How would you fill that in? Just pick one. You don't have to do all 2, right? How would you fill that in? And my other question to get us to reflect is, are we convicted to maybe stop trying to exercise dominion, control, and power in a world's way, and maybe dig into how God, and through the example of Jesus or the leading of the Holy Spirit, would ask us to exercise dominion that will change the world around us, whether that's in our classrooms, in our homes, in our workplaces, okay? So let me just pray, and then we'll